Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. Welcome to another installment of this year's Hannah's Bookukkah, where I post for all 8 nights of Hanukkah. Today, I want to make the first of 2 videos about 13 new editions. Actually, these are not new books, but all have either been recently re-released or their re-releases are forthcoming in 2025. Today, I'll talk very briefly about the first 7. A half dozen of these were holiday presents, which all arrived very recently on my shelves, and the other is a NetGalley advanced copy, currently queued up on my e-reader. Although, as I said, these particular editions are new, the texts are not. They're either classic books, depending on how you define that category, or lesser-known works that deserve new attention. And all of these editions are introduced by new introductions, often written by tremendous literary stars or literary scholars. Of course, the list I'm going to share today contains books that really excite me personally, but there are many other reissues coming out soon as well. During the video, I'll introduce you to several of my favorite reprint series, and that might be a good place to start for other recent and forthcoming classic releases. So let's get started. The first book is the only one I'm going to mention that's not part of a reprint series, and that is The Living Mountain by Nan Shepherd and published by Simon & Schuster. Robert McFarlane writes an introduction, and Jenny Odell writes an afterword. The Living Mountain is often considered a classic of nature writing, in the same light as Rachel Carson or John Muir. Here, Nan Shepherd meditates on her journeys into, quote, the high and holy places of Scotland's mountains. And although she wrote the book during World War II, it wasn't published for several more decades. I have a copy of this new edition on my e-reader, courtesy of NetGalley, and I read McFarlane's introduction late last night. One of the things he points out that I find really appealing is that while Shepherd is in some ways following the tradition of mountaineers writing about their adventures in the wild, her work is also dramatically different from theirs. As he says, her ultimate goal is not to reach the highest peak. She's more interested in connection with the wild than proving her dominance. Years ago, I tracked down a copy of The Living Mountain, and I had it on my nightstand, all ready to start. And David snatched it and put it on his side of the bed. He adored the book, but I've never read it. This new edition has reminded me of it and put it high on my list of books to get to soon. This edition will be released in the States in March, I believe. The next set of books I want to mention were published a little earlier this month by a brand new imprint, Smith and Taylor Classics. For the imprint's first run, they actually released 4 books, but for now, I'm only going to talk about 3. Why the name Smith and Taylor Classics, you ask? Well, the imprint's editors are Allison Miriam Smith and Brandon Taylor. I must be one of the few people on BookTube who has never read one of Brandon Taylor's books, but I've very recently been listening to podcasts he's guested on and reading his Substack. I am extraordinarily impressed by the depth of his thinking. In a future video, perhaps I'll recommend 1 or 2 of these podcasts. But on to the books the editors chose this time around. The first is a book I thought I had read decades ago, but when I picked it up in the fall of last year, I realized I was wrong, and it quickly rocketed to become one of my all-time favorite novels, and that is The Country Appointed Furs by Sarah Orne Jewett. I've mentioned it a few times here on this channel, but I haven't yet talked about it in depth, and I think this new edition will give me the perfect push to do that early in 2025. Instead of a new introduction, what we get is a dialogue, a conversation between the readers Brandy Jensen and Stephanie Hirschenau. I have mixed feelings about the choice to use this style. While I would have absolutely loved to hear the 2 of them live, talking to each other about the book I love, I wasn't persuaded by reading the transcript of their conversation. The casual and conversational style just doesn't quite work in print, I don't think. Nevertheless, the two of them do raise some quite interesting thoughts. Perhaps it's because I love the book so much, but I wanted to hear more. The dialogue felt too clipped, throwing out ideas, but not really developing them in any significant way. Now I want to invite them over for tea and pepper them with questions, pushing them to go further than they do in this little joint piece. Still, I'm thrilled to have this lovely edition. I love the front cover. The interior is beautiful. And on the back, we get this wonderful picture of Jewett, along with a brief quote from her, which I'll read. "I found the path. It was touching to discover that this lonely spot was not without its pilgrims." The next in the Smith & Taylor Classic set is Twilight Sleep by Edith Wharton. Although I love Wharton's novels in general, this is one I've not yet read, but it sounds fascinating. Basically, it addresses a typical Wharton interest, the lives of people living in New York who are in relationships threatening to fracture. The novel also focuses on the desperate ways the people try to deny or avoid pain. One of the reasons I'm especially interested in reading this novel is because it is fairly frequently considered Wharton's most modernist novel, where she wields narrative devices such as multi-perspective narration and a fascination with her characters' private internal lives, etc. This volume, like the Sarah Orne Jewett volume, concludes with a conversation between two great readers, and here's between the two main editors of the imprint, Brandon Taylor and Allison Miriam Smith. Also, like the Jewett novel, this features a wonderful photograph on the back and a short quote from the author. "Dancing meant nothing. It was like breathing. What would one be doing if one weren't dancing?" The final Smith & Taylor classic I'm going to hold up today is The Odd Woman, a novel by George Gissing. Gissing was a very prolific writer during the Victorian period, perhaps best known for his new Grub Street, which might be on my possibilities list for October 2025, depending on what the Victober prompts are. I read The Odd Women in Victober 2023, and I found it absolutely fascinating. I'll leave a link in the description box to my earlier discussion of the novel. At first, I wasn't sure I really needed to acquire another copy of The Odd Women, despite my abiding love for matching sets of books. But I quickly changed my mind when I saw that the conversation at the back of this book was by Merve Imre and Adam Dalva, contemporary critics I consider to be some of the sharpest knives in the drawer when it comes to literature. I'm not certain I'll actually reread the whole novel right now, but I am very much looking forward to reading their dialogue. And again, we get an author picture on the back, and also a quote from him. "She felt no love in return, but between the prospect of a marriage of esteem and that of no marriage at all, there was little room for hesitation." Next, I want to mention 3 books from a different classics imprint, McNALLY Editions. These have something in common with the look of the NYRB series, I think, with rectangles holding the titles, I guess. These are all quite nicely put together, paperbacks with French flaps and smooth, creamy paper inside. The first volume I want to mention is by the incomparable Dorothy Parker and is called Constant Reader, The New Yorker Columns, 1927 to 28. This is apparently a complete collection of her book reviews from that era, and I can't wait to dig in. The foreword to this volume is by Sloane Crossley, whose memoir Grief is for People was a book I enjoyed very much earlier this year, and who has a tongue nearly as sharp as Dorothy Parker's. And even the blurbs on the back are hysterical. Actually, let me read one of them. This one is from Joan Accacello. "The Constant Reader columns are not really book reviews. They are stand-up comedy routines. You don't have to listen to her opinion, she says. If she didn't like the book, maybe that's just her hangover speaking. Okay, another edition from McNally is a novel I'd never heard of until I saw this stunning cover, Ex-Wife by Ursula Parrott, originally published in 1929. The theme fits in with some of the other works of the Jazz Age, a world filled with speakeasies and nightclubs and raucous parties. I'm really interested in pairing this novel, the debut novel by a woman who chose to publish her first book anonymously, with Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby, which I really want to reread in the coming year. I've heard a rumor that in addition to covering similar themes in their novels, the two of them might have had an affair. At any rate, this particular edition of Parrott's work comes with a foreword by the essayist Alyssa Bennett and an afterword by Ursula Parrott's son, Mark Parrott. Sounds fascinating. So earlier in this video, I mentioned my love for the criticism of Merve Imre, and that love led me to pick up another new old book published by McNally. This one is I Am Alien to Life by Djuna Barnes, with a foreword from Imre. Barnes was a queer modernist writer during the 1920s and 1930s who grew up in New York, but spent quite a bit of time in Europe. Although I haven't actually read Barnes yet, I did mention the book that is probably her best-known work, Nightwood, in my video about classic lesbian fiction. I'll link to that video below. Anyway, I Am Alien to Life is a collection of her short stories. I do want to share one quote from the back cover. This is from Eileen Miles, who I've actually been thinking about a lot lately. She says that Barnes is, quote, like a dark lesbian genius rolling in a giant heap of damp, dead leaves. I don't think I've ever read a more evocative blurb. Well, before I wrap up today, let me list two related books, both also with recent or forthcoming dates. The first is from another publisher devoted to putting out new editions of already beloved books, and that's Dalkey Archive Essentials, who is putting out an edition of Djuna Barnes' novel, Writer. I also want to mention a new graphic biography of her, Djuna, The Extraordinary Life of Djuna Barnes, by John Macy, which I am very much looking forward to reading and looking at the wonderful artwork, despite the fact that I am kind of an incompetent reader of graphic books. More on that another time. Actually, I think I'm going to do a little mini focus on Djuna Barnes during Pride Month this coming year, and I'll be talking about her major work and her biography more then. Okay, that will do it for part one of my discussion of some classic books and a few lesser-known books that have been reprinted recently or are forthcoming. Any old favorites here? Anything you're excited to read or reread? I'd love to hear about it down in the comments. Well, thank you so much for joining me here today on Hannah's Books. See you soon, tomorrow, for part two of this discussion on the fifth night of Bookukkah.